Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. We're really pleased to have an extraordinary group and an extraordinary panel for this conversation. I'm James Newcomb, Managing Director at RMI, and pleased to help kick off this webinar on redesigning industry. This is the sixth in a series of webinars that have been inspired originally by RMI's publication of 7 challenges for energy transformation, a piece of work in which we looked at the sensitive intervention points in the global energy and economic system to achieve a low carbon future. We know that the challenges are formidable to be on a path to a 1.5C future, but we also know that there's extraordinary change happening across many sectors, and that the industrial sector is among the most important of those. Industry and heavy transport accounts for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions if we count both Scope 1 and Scope 2 carbon emissions plus methane. And under business as usual scenarios, these sectors by 2050 could consume fully twice the remaining carbon budget to achieve a 1.5C future. Fortunately, we're not likely to be on track to a business as usual future, and the participants in this call are among the leaders that are helping to ensure that that's the case. We have both corporate leaders and NGO voices and a perspective from the philanthropic world to help frame the pathways that are taking us to a more optimistic future. I want to introduce the speakers first, and then I'll turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Thomas Koch, who will lead the discussion. But we're super pleased today to have Jamie Gentoso, the CEO for US Cement at LafargeHolcim, Rebecca Dell, Program Strategist for Industry at ClimateWorks Foundation, and Andreas Regnell, Senior VP of Strategic Development at Vattenfall and Chairman of the Board of HYBRIT. We'll look forward to hearing questions from the floor later in the conversation, but we're going to start off with kind of a guided conversation that Thomas Koch will lead us through, and very much looking forward to all of your participation. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, James. And I'll kick us off here by turning to you, Jamie. I think we're going to dive right into the deep end of the pool here. I think you're representing the cement industry, which is arguably one of the hardest nuts to crack when it comes to decarbonization, where the technology pathway towards a zero carbon outcome is least clear, and where we're seeing trickles of progress here, but not at the pace of some other sectors. But with this said, there seems to have been quite some progress lately that I'd like to hear a little bit from you about. So could you tell me a little bit more about the work that LafargeHolcim is doing to reduce your climate impact? And you might need to unmute yourself, Jamie.
Sorry about that. Yeah, and just to step back a little bit, we are a cement producer, as you mentioned. Cement is the main ingredient in concrete, and concrete is a fundamental building material. Society is basically built on concrete. And, it's a material that many of us take for granted. It's a part of our life every day. And as we look to build, the infrastructure for the world's next 2 billion people, it will be very much a part of moving forward, and will grow in use, actually. And LafargeHolcim is the largest cement manufacturer in the world and in the U.S. We just on Monday committed to reducing our CO2 footprint by another 40% by 2030 and getting to net zero by 2050. So big task ahead of us. Luckily, we did not start on Monday. We've been working on this for some period of time, especially here in the U.S. Over the last two years, especially since I've been here, really been working toward accelerating our decreasing our carbon footprint. For us, that happens in many ways. First, we start at the beginning of our process and procurement of our raw materials and our fuels. We actually have the ability to utilize waste materials or waste streams in our process. So we have a wholly owned subsidiary called GeoCycle, which helps identify waste streams. One example that I could point out that most people can relate to is eggshells. So the pharmaceutical companies use eggs in the manufacture of vaccines, and so they have the eggshells as a byproduct. They provide a great source of calcium for us. So we can take those and use them as a raw material, and we can also use them. They have calorific value as well, so they can be used as a fuel. So being able to take waste and use it in our process. Last year, we utilized 2 million tons of waste materials, otherwise would have gone into landfills. And we have a goal over the next 3 years to at least double that. So really aggressive in trying to take materials that otherwise would be landfills and put them to great use. We are also focused on the use of renewable energy. We just turned on 3 wind turbines at our plant in Paulding, Ohio, and we are about to start up a solar field at our plant in Hagerstown. So really focused on trying to have as much renewable energy available to us as possible. We're really big landowners. We have big quarries that have lots of life to them for us, but we won't get to them for several years. So we're focused on, using that land as responsibly as possible. We're also working to reduce our clinker factor. So every ton of clinker that we make produces CO2. And the more we can replace those tons of clinker with supplementary cementitious materials that can also make good, durable concrete, the better off we are. So we're really pushing right now the use of blended products. Also really engaged in innovation. So looking to make clinkers that are much, that can be higher, more reactive, I guess I should say, so you need less cement in concrete. But also, looking at new and innovative clinkers, right? So we're working with a company named Solidia, and we actually produce Solidia clinker at our plant in Whitehall. This is a cement that actually cures with mass amounts of CO2. So this is a really great potential product for the future. And it's actually been now commercialized and being used. And then finally, we are really engaged in the use of carbon capture. So we have a project right now going on at our Portland, Colorado plant. Happy to say that we just got support from the DOE for funding to continue to move forward with that, where we'll capture 6,000 tons a day of CO2. So that is a little bit more futuristic, but we have to start right now. So those are just some of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. And if we take a little bit of a step back, LafargeHolcim is the largest producer of cement and concrete, but you're operating in a broader context of an industry and a broader context of a market. What are there's a lot of announcements being made at the moment, especially a week like this during Climate Week. Which of these would you think? Would you say that you're most proud of being part of, and what do you think makes a material difference to the environment that you're operating in?
So, I would say the fact that LafargeHolcim has stepped up, with these targets and science-based targets also, which I think is really significant. We're the first cement manufacturer to do that. But also the GCCA, which is the broader cement organization, has gotten out there and committed to net zero also. So, throughout the world, cement is responsible, probably the single biggest industry for 7 to 8% of the world's CO2. And as I just discussed earlier, we will continue to use concrete, right? So if the industry as a whole can't commit to net zero, I think as a society, we don't have a chance of getting to net zero or meeting the 1.5 degree C. So really significant that the industry has now come together and committed to this. And happy to be a part of that, So, I mean, very, very proud of what we're doing at LafargeHolcim. But, as an industry, I think, we've stepped up to the plate and said we will and can do this.
Great. I'll turn to you, Andreas. You represent not only a single company, but also a joint venture across a steelmaker, an iron producer, and a utility. And you're trying to innovate in steel making to create a carbon-free product here. Where would you say that you, in your work and the industry as a whole, stand in this in the deployment of this technology?
I think just to clarify what the whole idea is about is that we, instead of using coal or rather coke to take the oxygen out of iron ore, we use hydrogen. So we create water instead of CO2. And we've come, I mean, quite far in the sense that we've inaugurated a $200 million pilot plant the other week together with the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, which just essentially is a sign that we have strong political support, and people believe in this idea that when it was launched a few years ago was more seen as something completely crazy. But of course, we're still on a demo plant level, and this autumn we will start doing just kind of calibrate the plant with using natural gas, and then after spring 2021 we will start using pure hydrogen, and of course I think we've done a lot of laboratory tests before that, but I think we've come it's difficult to say, but we've come a long way. Whether it's halfway or not, I can't say, but of course the real proof of funding is when we scale it up to millions of tons. But we've come a long way, and we have still found no showstoppers.
Great. And you're one player out of many in the steel industry. Why is this pilot plant such a big deal?
First, because it actually exists. That's a big deal in itself, because a lot of people talk a lot about hydrogen, but they still are very much in the PowerPoint level. We have some steel and concrete, by the way, up there, and it's a 75-meter tall building with real equipment that will actually produce fossil-free iron sponge, because of course, so you get iron sponge out of this manufacturing process, and then you move that into the steel mill to make the steel. And there are fossil emissions before and after this step of the value in the value chain, but this is the most important step. So that's why it's a big deal, and it's a physically a big deal.
And you're a first mover in many aspects at the same time here. You across all participants in this joint venture, you're stepping outside of the traditional way of doing things. How did you get past the, if you like, the PowerPoint stage that you referred to, or the analysis paralysis, and sort of how did you dare to cross the barrier that few others have crossed?
I think it's a very important question, and I think a few stars need to be aligned, but I think the most important star in that alignment is that you go from a forecasting to a backcasting perspective on the world. Because with the forecasting, which is kind of what can I do given reality, and even I'm super ambitious, I'm still stuck in reality. Versus a backcasting is to say, well, I need to be in a certain place by 2050, and where do I then need to be by now? And that is a big difference. And the day you start to believe that, taking a backcasting perspective, because do we believe that there is a need for steel in 2050? If you answer yes to that question, do you think that there will be a market for fossil steel in that? And if you say no to that question, you're suddenly in a big hurry, and you begin to see commercial opportunities, given that you know about the timelines to change things. And I think that's essentially what, and I give a lot of credit to the steel, our steel partner SSAB, and the CEO and the head of R&D, Martin Lindqvist and Martin Pay in that company, because I think they kind of, I don't know, I mean, one day they woke up and they realized that, well, we just can't go on like this. And they saw it as a big opportunity. It was not a defensive move. They turned it into offensive move to start working on this. And I think that's what this, essentially the discussion we have, is all about. Because as soon as you start having a backcasting perspective and you believe it's a commercial, it's a competitive advantage to think like that, you will start moving. And I think many of the announcements we heard this week, I mean, China, Europe going to 55%. I mean, there are many of kind of announcements in that will help people to take that backcasting perspective, and that will get things going. And then, of course, we need support, and we need CO2 pricing, and we need transparency on the CO2, etc. But I think as soon as the majority of people start taking a backcasting perspective, things will get moving fast. And we're just maybe a bit of forerunners in doing that.
Great, thanks. Rebecca, you've been working alongside industry for quite some time by now. What would you say, based on your experience in this space of trying to influence industry to pivot towards lower carbon assets, what would you say is the biggest difference? What is the shift that has happened, if any, over the last 5 or 10 years?
Thanks so much, Thomas. That's a really great question. And I think actually Andreas pointed in an important way to the most important thing that's changed in the last year or two, which is a conceptual shift. It's very clear that there's momentum gathering. People are, the number of people who are interested in this issue has expanded enormously in the last few years. The level of ambition that people are thinking about has increased enormously in the last couple of years. And I think that has to do, a lot of that has to do with the conceptual shift that Andreas was talking about. One kind of important contributor to that was, after the IPCC 1.5 report in 2018, that really forced everybody to have a conversation about how do we get to zero. And before that, we were having a conversation about how do we get to, 80% reduction. And it was very easy for a lot of different economic actors, including heavy industry, to say, well, we're going to be in the 20%. There was a lot more than 20% worth of the emissions that was imagining themselves to be in the 20%. But when the conversation moves to how do we get to zero, then all of a sudden everybody is accountable. Everybody has to be part of the conversation. And so I think that in some ways is the most important thing that has changed in the last few years. And then I think, accompanying that conceptual shift has been real progress seen in technology, in markets, and in business models. People are thinking very seriously about alternative ways of making emissions-intensive commodities, and not just thinking about it, they're building things. HYBRIT is the kind of the charismatic megafauna of this effort, but it's far from the only one. People are also thinking about how do we change business models and market structures to use these materials more efficiently, to use them more circularly, to get more value, to really recognize how valuable things like steel and cement and aluminum and chemical products can be, and make sure that we're not wasting that value. We're not throwing it away, but we're getting the maximum use out of it. And so, those are on the broadest level, those are some of the changes that I've seen in the last few years.
Great, thanks. So with that said, we're still talking about the first of a lot of things here. We're talking about the first hydrogen plant. We're talking about the first full carbon capture on a cement plant. What do you think is most pressingly required to go from these pilots to a full global rollout that actually moves the needle on the big scale here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the number one most important thing that we need are well-defined, accountable markets for low carbon alternatives to traditional commodities. We need people and organizations and governments who are willing to commit to and then actually do go out and preferentially purchase these the low carbon alternatives, whether those are substitute materials made in different ways, and we need credibility around those markets. So we need good accounting practices for how we make sure that we know the emissions that are associated with different products and things like that. But I think without clear demand for these products, it's very hard to see how companies can invest in producing them. And so one of the most important ways to make those markets that is an area that I've been working on is a set of government policies that are kind of collectively referred to as Buy Clean. And the idea here is that in the United States, fully half of all of the cement is purchased with taxpayer dollars. And it's going into public construction and infrastructure, public works of different kinds. And so we should be using those taxpayer dollars to incentivize lower carbon, more environmentally responsible production. We should be, and there's a lot of different ways we can do that, but that's a way that we can create an assured market, a big and important assured market for building materials of all kinds that could be used to justify serious investment in new capital that can produce much lower emissions building materials.
Thanks, Rebecca. Jamie, market demand of a lower carbon product obviously is important here. What signals, if any, are you seeing in the market at the moment that you're actually selling into, that there is a customer, the customers want you to provide these lower carbon products?
Yeah, so this is a fundamental issue for us overall. There is, very little to no demand from our customer base for low carbon products. I think we're starting to hear a little bit more, but where it's mostly coming from is the actual, end user up the value chain, the owner, right? So as Rebecca mentioned, 40% of our product goes into infrastructure. So if we're having the conversations with our policymakers about let us help you procure better, it's fundamental to what we do right now. So we need the pull from the owner side, and that's really what we're seeing most right now. But from our side, what we're trying to do is, so we just launched in July, we're putting in place EPDs, or environmental product declarations, for each of our products. These are much like food labels that you see on a can of tomato soup, and essentially what it'll tell our customers is this product is good for you, right? Or it's good for the environment. And so it's up to us right now to take these tools, use them, educate our customers, and really get them thinking in the right direction. And I think we've got some customers that are headed that way, but it's not just our customer, it's our customer's customer, which is the concrete contractor, right? So there needs to be incentives for them to change what they've done all along, and there is some I guess a little trepidation about changing the materials that we've been using for hundreds of years, because they do hold up buildings, right? They're important. And but luckily, many of these materials, we've been using for 20, 30, 40 years in some places, and the buildings are still standing up. So we just need to turn people's minds and, really start thinking about what the future looks like, not just for that building, but, for society in general. So I think we'll get there, and I think we're getting there quicker, especially with the pull from, the owners in the state, federal, and local governments.
And in order to get there, do you think it's more important to have more voluntary commitments, or more important to have policy in place to create the market that you're selling into, or a combination of the two?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's got to be a combination of the two, right? So policy is important, and that's also why I'm a part of the CEO Climate Dialogue. This is a group of Fortune 500 CEOs and NGOs that have come together to push our legislators to put in long-term climate policy, including a price on carbon. So, we believe that that's very important in terms of, to really move the needle. But, again, I think we need a pull from our customer base as well. And that's where it's up to us to come up with those products that are environmentally friendly. So we've relaunched our Enviro4 line of products, which, they've been around for some period of time, but we felt the need to really get back out to the customer base and say, this is why you should be using them, not just because they make good, durable concrete, but because they're also good for the environment. On our ready mix side, we also just launched a new line of branded products called EcoPact. So, you know, really it's also making these available to our customers and actually marketing. So, and I hate to say it, but when you're in a business like concrete, which is a little bit more of a commodity type business, we haven't had to market ourselves. You know, so marketing isn't really innate to get people to understand, you know, the attributes of our product and what's important. So I think it's, again, up to industry to kind of step up and help educate our customers and get them on board with the use of these products.
So speaking of policies, Rebecca, on your behalf, I'll just claim that you're well-oriented in policy, both in the US and globally. I think it'll be interesting to hear your view on, I mean, we're starting off in an existing policy space already. It's not only about new policy. Which policies in the US or globally would you say are most effectively holding back industry from moving on a more carbon effective pathway?
Thanks so much. That's a good question, because we have a lot of conversations about what are the policies to support decarbonization, and sometimes we skip over the fact that there's some existing structures in place that are not really helping us out. And so I think that there are pardon me. So there's a few that I would highlight in particular. The first is that many of the products that we are, that are associated with the largest quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, products like steel and cement, are internationally traded. Chemicals also internationally traded. And we have a very, sort of very deep in our conceptual foundation for how we think about climate change is we tend to talk about emissions based on where they're produced, not where where the ultimate benefit accrues. And so this creates an incentive for what's called carbon leakage, which is basically like, you try and tighten the screws on emissions in your country, and so people just move their factories to another country. And that is obviously a bad outcome for everybody. And so we need to, we're unlikely to kind of seriously re-examine the idea of production-based emissions accounting, but we need to take that into account in all of the policy efforts that we talk about. That's why these kind of market creation policies are so important, because those do not have associated with them that incentive to try and just sort of move your emissions extra jurisdictionally. Another area where where there's potential barriers coming from our existing frameworks is around codes, standards, and existing specifications for building materials. This is a very complicated issue. There's a huge patchwork of different approaches. It's better in some jurisdictions and worse in others. But particularly around building materials, there are a lot of rules around building materials that were not made with the idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in mind. And so they can be quite prescriptive, and it can be a years-long process to get a new building material that's just as good from a technical perspective, to get it so it's approved for use. And so that's another area where policy is creating current barriers.
Great. And pivoting to new policy, there's there's a lot of people are promoting a global carbon tax as the single most effective policy intervention. Do you agree with that in theory and more importantly in practice? And if not, what do we do instead?
Yeah, so I'm not opposed to carbon taxes. If that's what we want to do, sure, that's great. Sign me up. I think that could be very effective. In practice, I think that there are two problems. One is a very general one. One is more particular to what we're talking about today. The general problem is that, you know, we don't have a government of the world. And so the coordination problem around implementing something like that is very, very high. And it's unlikely that we will be able to overcome it anytime in the near future. The thing that's more specific to the work that we're talking about in this conversation is that, as I was talking about a moment ago with building codes, there are a lot of specific barriers to the deployment of low carbon industrial practices and technologies. And that a carbon tax or sort of broad-based carbon pricing doesn't actually help you get over those specific barriers. And some of those barriers are high enough that that we would need really a very high price on carbon to kind of catalyze the shift. So to give an example of some of those types of barriers, so I already mentioned building codes, standards, and specifications. We also have the issues around supply chains. So, Jamie talked about how where there's interest in low carbon cement and concrete products, it's for the people who own the building, the people at the end of the supply chain who are not, in fact, LafargeHolcim's customers. LafargeHolcim's customers are contractors and people at intermediate stages. And so getting that, how do we move that motivation through what can be very long and complicated supply chains? That actually requires some focused interventions and some, that carbon pricing would help with, but wouldn't necessarily solve. There's also problems around access to energy. These industries are called energy intensive for a reason. And a lot of facilities, particularly in the steel industry and the chemical industry, but really in all of these industries, the facility was built in the first place because it had really good access to the energy resources that it needed. And so if we're thinking about shifting the energy resources that we're going to be using, that's going to require society-wide planning on how do we get the energy, the clean energy that we need to the facilities that we have. How do we shift supply chains? Those are things that very, very hard to do without sort of active coordination by probably a government. And then there's the issue about technology risk and risk aversion for the implementation of new materials and new products. And again, like all of these things are, carbon pricing would help with any of this, but carbon pricing would not address directly any of these very important barriers. And so even if we had carbon pricing, we would still need other things, other interventions to complement it.
Right, thank you. And you touched on the need for a massive shift of energy supply. And I'd like to ask you, Andreas, now putting on the hat of a representative from the utility industry, because not only in steel making directly or indirectly through hydrogen, but also there are some pilots in electrified cement making. We're electrifying trucking and automotive industries, and we're doing a lot of electrification in these roadmaps to a point where, by 2050, some of these analyses indicate almost a tripling of the global electricity production compared to today. So, from the utility point of view, how are you preparing for this massive growth over the next 30 years?
Well, I mean, you can take two perspectives. I'll start with the societal perspective, and I think that's an example of where the backcasting has just begun in the sense of adding the numbers, as you just exemplified, the 3 times need for electricity. But I mean, if you start doing it the next level and just, okay, so how much electricity will France need, Germany need, the US, etc. That calculation it's beginning to happen. And when Germany recently did it, when they announced their hydrogen strategy, they immediately came to the conclusion that all that electricity cannot be produced in Germany. We have to do it in Morocco and elsewhere in Northern Africa, and bring the hydrogen in that way. And it just happens that maybe Morocco also needs more electricity. So there is an element of that equation isn't solved from a total perspective. So that's another one of those where we just need to realize the volumes and just do the math and count backwards, and more needs to happen than is happening today. From the other perspective, as a utility, we had the Capital Markets Day yesterday and talked to our investors, our debt holders, and I mean, we couldn't stop talking about all the opportunities we have, because of course this is from a utility perspective, and maybe it's a bit different if you're a US or European utility, but given that we're completely deregulated and fully commercial, I mean, it's just a commercial company. So for us, it's of course the sky's the limit. So for us, it's more, we sit on a huge option portfolio of investment opportunities for us. So for us, it's really about selecting and finding capital partners so that we can take on as much of moving as we can, because we see that both have kind of as our purpose to enable fossil-free living within one generation is the purpose of Vattenfall. So I think one needs to distinguish between those two perspectives. I think the world isn't really ready, and they haven't done the math. But as a utility, it's of course just enormous growth opportunities out.
So somewhere between now and 2050, if we're going to triple our electricity demand, you should start seeing significant movement in the near-term outlook. Are you seeing that already in your markets?
We're seeing it because, right, I mean, the demand hasn't increased yet, but we see it in those kind of discussions that have a long duration. So, for example, we already see a very strong increase in investments in the net, or required investments in the network, for, among others, the HYBRIT project. But we also have some others wanting to do electrofuels. We have battery factories in north of Sweden, as you might know, Northvolt. And so in Sweden, where Vattenfall is one of the major operations, we see it in terms of the electrical infrastructure investments going through the roof. In other markets, we see it in a different way, because then some of these companies, that Northvolt, that want to build their second factory together with Volkswagen just out in Germany, or Tesla that wants to build, that we're also in discussion with, they just don't know how to get hold of the green electrons. So they get stuck earlier. I mean, in the Nordics, we actually have the green electrons, or the fossil-free electrons. We just need to move them around better with the strengthened infrastructure. In Europe, they are not even there yet. So we're beginning to see the scarcities. It's just, what is the scarcity? It's a bit different depending on where you are.
Great, thanks. And I'm seeing that we have quite a number of. Oh, of course.
Just one comment, coming back to what's needed to get the markets going, and I completely agree that policy is very helpful, transparency is super helpful. If anything, I think it's even more helpful. So the EPDs that Jamie talked about is kind of one tool to get that going. But one, I think that we're realizing is that there is the procurement departments of many of these big corporates, because a lot of this is B2B. The procurement departments, they are evaluated on savings from year to year. So if you come there and say you need to pay more for the same thing, it's like running into a brick wall. And they're meant to be fortresses. That's what good procurement departments are. They are fortresses that don't listen. That's the way you become a successful procurement manager. So that's actually an interesting thing. And I think that's what happened to the German car industry. That the senior management, they realized that they need the batteries, but they forgot to tell the procurement department. So they got in a hurry, and that's why they're now paying to invest for a supplier to build a factory that didn't exist when they wrote the contract, which is kind of unheard in the car industry. But I think we will see more of that unless there is a stronger connect between senior management, the capital, because in the end, it's the capital providers that gives the fastest answer to whether you have a viable business or not, because if your capital costs go up, you're dead. So you have the financial markets, senior management, procurement department.
Great. I think we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. So James, if you are up for it, I'd like to pivot a little bit while I look through the questions here and bring some of them forward. Maybe we can start the Q&A questions with a few broader questions that are not directed to any specific panelist.
Yeah, actually, I was going to pick up, I've been looking through that queue of questions as well. I was going to pick up a couple of them. So how about I start with a couple, Thomas, and let you transition over to you. One of them is, specific to Jamie. 40% by 2030 is a really ambitious goal. And the question is, what's in your plan to get there?
Yeah, so I mentioned a lot of it already. So the renewables being one of them. You know, one of the other pieces is I didn't mention yet is many of our plants are built to use both coal and petcoke. So getting away from the use of that with the alternative fuels, but also moving over to natural gas. So getting the ability to have unconstrained natural gas at all of our plants is right now we don't have that. So, you know, a lot less CO2 footprint from there. And then we hope to have carbon capture up and running by 2024. That is the goal, to have that unit running at Portland. And obviously, you know, this other piece I talked about, the solidity of cement, we actually need to have CO2 available to us. So the only available CO2 right now for, you know, that cement is actually food grade CO2. So we actually need to capture carbon, more capture carbon in order to really grow the market for that type of cement or any sort of concretes that need CO2 to cure. So those are, you know, more carbon capture is obviously in the plan. You know, so again, many of those other things that I mentioned, but you know, that is the thing that we did right as we went out and we talked about the fact that, you know, we will reduce by 40% by 2030. We have science-based targets. We can get there. So we have created the path that will actually get us there. In the US, I will tell you, there's a lot more room than we have in Europe and places like that, because they've been, you know, really out on an aggressive path for some period of time to reduce their CO2 footprint. In the US, it's, you know, I'll tell you, our clinker factor is somewhere around, you know, as an industry average, probably around 92%, whereas in Europe, they're at around 70. So, you know, we will have a big impact as we make the changes here in the United States on the overall group. So it's exciting to be a big part of the measurement, but a big part of, you know, the ability to really have an impact. So.
That's terrific. Congratulations. I mean, most encouraging thing I've heard all week. So good to hear. So one more that was in the queue from participants that has been touched on, but let's just take it on head on, is around finance. The comment noted that $40 trillion in global fund managers have committed to carbon neutrality in their portfolios. And so Andreas mentioned this, you know, the role of finance. I'm curious to just hear from any or all of you about the role that you see finance playing. Climate-aligned finance is increasingly a principle or reference point for many, but there is a long way to go to make it an operational reality. And so I'm just interested to hear from you, your perspectives on how far along are we on that, and how fast or slow you see the reality of it coming into the marketplace and into decisions that affect you. Andreas, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think that climate geared finance, I think at least the world that I know, it's more describing what they will not invest in. It's not that they will invest in climate depending on return, because it's still the same return requirements. Well, maybe somewhat lower, but because they see that it's lower risk. But it's not like finance will solve it. It's business cases that will solve it, and then we will drown in money. That's more. So I mean, already HYBRIT, I don't know how many banks that talk to me and they want to finance it, but then okay, I mean, it's not like they're going to give us money. They want to have the solid business case, and it still needs to go to the same credit committees that might have somewhat kind of lower risk hurdles or to pass it through, but it's still this. So finance will not solve it. It's the business cases that will solve it, and then the financing will not be a problem. And that's how I would like to describe it. I mean, apart from state financing, but then we're not talking about financing. Then we're talking about grants or subsidies, and that is likely to be a big, important part of the equation, so that there is a business case for the commercial players to put all of that their money into.
Yeah, Rebecca?
Yeah, so I'm glad Andreas mentioned the issue about public finance, which is quite different than private finance, and I think is extremely important, particularly in the stages where there's still significant technology risk, because it's very unlikely that private financial actors are going to be interested in assuming any of that or any significant portion of that technology risk. But I would also add that I think Andreas is right. The business case leads and the financing follows. But the financing can follow. I think it's important to recognize how quickly the financing can follow, because we don't need to have the general mass of these industries to move to clean practices before the before the investments will shift. The investments shift as soon as it becomes clear that all of the growth in the industry is coming from clean assets and clean investments, and that will happen many years before we get to the point where clean production is the dominant mode. So I think finance is as in all things has the potential to be an incredibly important enabler, but right now, the problem with the business case is not that the weighted average cost of capital is too high. There are bigger problems with business cases that we need to solve first.
Go ahead, Jamie. Yeah.
So a few other questions, unless you had something, James, you wanted to bring up.
To jump in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention quickly and briefly, but just to give you a little bit of from our perspective, at the end of 2019, when we went to investors and speaking with them about our results, so we'd had 13 straight quarters of improvement, continuous improvement in our results. And the first question by every single investor was, how are you going to deal with your carbon footprint for the future? So not wanting to talk about, how well we've done as a company, how we're going to continue these great results, but how are you going to continue your business in the future? And this is a big risk overall. So I think, to me, that speaks volumes in terms of what we must do as a business in moving forward.
Great. There is some interest here, Andreas, around the specific setup around HYBRIT. I think the questions are focusing a little bit on the hydrogen supply, of how are you actually planning to manufacture and source the hydrogen for the steel? And secondly, how are you thinking about synergies with other uses of hydrogen in that context?
Okay. I mean, the sourcing of the hydrogen, we will produce the hydrogen or kind of next to the what we call the rocket, the way you actually process the pellet together with the hydrogen. So the sourcing is then electricity, and we have actually excess of fossil-free electricity in the Nordic market for some years to come. So that's actually not a big deal. I mean, the big deal is actually to get the infrastructure to get the power, because we're talking about 500 to 600 megawatts for the demo plant, and if you go for a full-scale plant, we believe it's more like 1.5 gigawatts. So I mean, that's the bigger issue. In the short term, there is also an issue of actually sourcing the electrolyzers, because the market isn't that big for electrolyzers today. So that if you want to buy 600 megawatts of electrolyzing capacity, it's more than the global production, at least 2019, and that's growing by the day. But it's it's actually complex procurement process, because you have to buy something that doesn't really exist yet, a bit like buying fossil-free steel today. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we will, and then alternative uses for hydrogen. I think there might be some add-on business cases, given that we'll have such a huge production of hydrogen in one place. But given that it's where the manufacturing is, which is north of Sweden, so it's not close to kind of a big city area or a population center where you can use a significant amount of hydrogen in that. But the idea is to build quite a large storage facility, so that we can be flexible in our use of electricity, to store the energy in form of hydrogen, so that we can be more flexible towards electricity system, and thereby getting a lower average electricity price going into the process. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. There's one more question I'd like to highlight. I think I'll let anyone give your point of view. Is referring to the discussions in the European Union right now of introducing border tariffs on imports. And I guess the question for you is, what do you think, because that's not a global carbon tax, but it's a carbon tax on imports from the global market. What is your view on the potential impact of such a tax, and if there will be responses from other regions of the world, which effectively makes it a global carbon tax?
So
Rebecca,
I will,
please.
Should I? Great. Yeah, so I think that this is a really interesting and important discussion. And I think that, border tariffs, carbon tariffs are they are one potentially important policy mechanism for reducing the carbon leakage that I mentioned earlier in this conversation. But they are by no means the only mechanism for that. And so we should not limit the conversation to just border carbon tariffs or carbon tariffs. And I think from an American perspective, we've had an interesting experiment with this by accident in the last few years, which is that we unilaterally imposed tariffs on, not for environmental reasons, but we did it nonetheless, on two very emissions intensive commodities, namely steel and aluminum. And what has happened as a result of that is that many manufacturers have simply shifted to importing intermediate goods instead of importing the materials themselves. So they've just moved one step down in the supply chain to an intermediate good that doesn't have the tariff and imported that. And so actually domestic steel manufacturers have not really benefited from the carbon tariffs. And so you have the steel and aluminum tariffs. And so you have a problem with carbon tariffs generally, which is that if we generally talk about applying them just to the most emissions intensive products, which are the commodity products. And if you do that, then you have this, people just shift down the supply chain one step. And so then you can expand your tariffs to go one step further down the supply chain, and then people might just shift one step down. And you get what's called a tariff cascade. And so the alternative is to impose these tariffs on all products, have them be broad-based across the economy, which prevents, which addresses this problem, but makes them much more difficult to implement. And so, not to say that carbon tariffs are a bad idea, but that we should think about them in the context of other policies like the grants and subsidies that Andreas mentioned, like export subsidies for particular types of products, like market creation through product standards and buy clean, all of these things which might actually achieve the goal, which is to decarbonize existing domestic industry more effectively.
Jamie, do you want to say something too on this topic?
Yeah, so, from our perspective, we are a very trade exposed company or industry. So it's really important for us that there's a level playing field if any sort of carbon tax should be put in place, and need to make sure that there's a level playing field with importers. I will tell you also, like even currently in the United States, the level of emission controls that we must have is a large cost to us already. So if you compare us to producers, say in Vietnam or China or Turkey, they can be very competitive on imports into the U.S. with cement, which you wouldn't think, but there's a lot of cement that is currently imported. So something from our industry is something that's really important.
Great. I think we're coming up against the end of the panel. I'd like to just mention briefly, there are some comments about video and audio quality. I think we're on the panel here, we're experiencing a pretty decent quality. So the recording of this conversation will likely be better quality than what some participants have experienced while streaming it live. So I'd recommend anyone who missed something or want to get back to the topics to just watch the recording that will be available. And I think with that, James, I'll hand over to you to wrap us up and take through the last few minutes of the panel.
Yeah, well, it just remains to me to say thanks both to panel and participants. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think partly looking at the parallel and complementary challenges in two major energy-intensive industries is part of the learning curve for all of us to understand how to deliver solutions. Because as Rebecca has pointed out, there are plenty of trying to approach this problem in a very narrow way is going to lead to problems that slip out from under the effective reach of those approaches. So I think by bringing our intentions together and looking at the challenge in a little more holistic way, we're likely to make great progress. And I'm really, really grateful to the panel for having shown the light for us. So thanks, everyone. Please don't hesitate to contact any of us directly with follow-up questions that you might have, and we will keep this effort going forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.